Voices through the walls, true stories from death row nights. The screaming started just after midnight. It cut through the concrete like a blade, sharp, sudden, and filled with a kind of fear that no one on death row could hide from, even if they tried. Inside the execution tier, the lights never fully went out. They dimmed to a sick yellow glow that made every shadow look alive. Steel doors lined the narrow corridor. Behind each one was a man waiting for the state to decide the day he would die. On this night, the air felt heavier than usual. An inmate 3 cells down from the observation desk began pounding on his metal door, once, twice, then over and over until the entire tier vibrated. Guards rushed in, boots striking the concrete floor in controlled urgency. They'd heard this before, the nights when execution dates got close. But this sounded different. More voices joined in. Not shouting at officers, shouting into the walls. Some prayed loudly. Others begged for forgiveness from people who weren't there. One man laughed, not because anything was funny, but because his mind had nowhere else to go. In cell 17, a prisoner sat frozen on his bunk, eyes wide open. He wasn't the one screaming. He was listening. Every night for weeks, he had heard the same sounds, crying, whispering, men talking to themselves in the dark. But tonight, it was louder, closer, almost inside his own head. This was the final week before the execution of a man housed 2 doors away from him, a case that had drawn national attention, protests, and media trucks outside the prison gates. Inside these walls, though, there were no cameras. Only voices. The prisoner in cell 17 pressed his ear to the cold concrete. That's when he heard it. A quiet voice, speaking his name from the other side of the wall, from a cell that guards swore was empty. And at that exact moment, the execution watch alarm began to sound. Weeks earlier, before the screaming nights and the execution alarms, cell 17 belonged to a man named Raymond Booker, a real death row inmate transferred into the unit after nearly a decade inside high-security federal prisons. Booker had been convicted of a double homicide tied to a failed armed robbery in Texas. The case drew national headlines because of the brutality of the crime and the fact that one of the victims was a correctional officer working an off-duty security job. The jury returned a death sentence after just 4 hours of deliberation. By the time Booker arrived on death row, he had already spent years in segregation units. But nothing prepared him for execution housing. Here, time didn't move forward. It waited. His transfer process was silent and clinical. Shackles on wrists and ankles. Waist chain locked tight. Armed escorts on both sides. No conversation beyond commands. When the steel door to cell 17 slammed shut for the first time, Booker reportedly stood still for almost 10 minutes, studying the walls like they were closing in. Execution tier inmates lived alone, 23 hours a day in isolation. Meals came through a slot. Recreation meant 1 hour in a caged yard the size of a parking space. Human contact was reduced to voices echoing through vents and plumbing pipes. At first, Booker kept to himself. Guards noted he was alert but calm, reading legal paperwork, writing letters, exercising in his cell. Standard behavior for inmates fighting appeals. But death row had its own psychological gravity. Within weeks, officers logged changes. Booker began staying awake through the night. He'd sit on his bunk, staring at the wall he shared with a neighboring cell, the one housing an inmate whose execution date had just been scheduled. That was when Booker first reported hearing voices. Not imaginary voices, but the constant sound of men breaking down behind concrete. Crying, praying, bargaining with God. And every night, as the execution date drew closer, the noise grew louder, until sleep on the tier became almost impossible. The week the execution warrant was signed, the entire tier changed. Guards stopped calling it death row and started calling it the watch. Extra officers were posted. Radios stayed clipped to chests. Every movement was logged. Every sound was treated like a warning. The condemned inmate 2 cells away was placed on suicide precautions, lights on all night, checks every 15 minutes. Sleep disappeared. For everyone. Booker later described the nights as endless loops of sound. Chains rattling during checks. Boots stopping outside doors. The low mechanical hum of the ventilation system, and layered beneath it all, the human noise. One man sobbed uncontrollably. Another shouted Bible verses until his voice went hoarse. Someone whispered apologies to a mother who would never hear them. At first, Booker tried to block it out. He stuffed paper into his ears. He paced his cell until his legs burned. He counted breaths. Nothing worked. The walls carried everything. Guards began filing reports about increased agitation across the tier. Inmates refusing meals. Men pressing emergency buttons just to hear a human voice. Officers themselves admitted the noise was getting to them, that the tension felt like standing inside a room waiting for an explosion. Then came the incident. During a routine check just after 2 a.m., an officer heard Booker yelling, not screaming, but arguing. When staff approached his cell, they saw him standing inches from the wall, responding to someone who wasn't visible. He wasn't violent. He was terrified. Booker insisted the man next door was talking to him, not through vents, not through pipes, but through the concrete. He said the voice begged him to stay awake, said falling asleep meant something terrible would happen. Mental health staff were called in before sunrise. They didn't remove him. Instead, they documented something far more alarming. Booker wasn't the only inmate reporting the same thing. Multiple men, housed separately, all described hearing the same pattern of voices, growing louder as the execution date approached. And the night before the execution, the voices stopped completely. The silence that followed was worse. Execution day began long before sunrise. The tier was placed on full lockdown. Movement stopped. Meals were delivered early. Officers spoke in low voices, radios turned down but never off. Inside cell 17, Booker hadn't slept in nearly 40 hours. He sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the wall that had carried weeks of human sound, crying, praying, bargaining, until it suddenly carried nothing at all. The silence had started the night before. No whispers. No sobbing. No pacing chains. Just the hum of the ventilation system and the distant echo of boots during watch checks. To Booker, it felt like the prison itself was holding its breath. Shortly after 6 a.m., the execution team arrived on the tier. Witness officers. Medical staff. Administrative officials. Every step followed protocol refined over decades inside American death chambers. 2 cells down, the condemned inmate was removed under heavy escort. Chains. Waist restraints. Black box cuffs. No resistance was reported. As policy required, the tier remained silent during the walk. Inmates stood at their doors, some watching through narrow windows, others turning away. Booker pressed his ear to the wall one last time as the footsteps passed. Nothing. For the first time in weeks, there were no voices coming through the concrete. Not fear, not prayer, not rage. Just absence. Hours later, the official time of death was announced over internal radio. The reaction across the tier wasn't loud. It was quiet, heavy, final. That night, officers noted an unusual calm. Inmates who hadn't slept in days finally lay down. Meal trays were accepted without protest. Emergency buttons stayed dark. But Booker didn't sleep. Near midnight, as the lights dimmed again to their yellow haze, he heard it. Faint at first. Then clearer. Crying, but distant now. Not coming from the cell that had gone empty, but from somewhere deeper in the tier. A new execution date had just been posted. And the voices had already begun again.